The Many Deaths of Harry Potter, written by ShayneT. Chapter 6. Flying. Simply making it into the station was a major accomplishment as far as Harry was concerned. He was acutely aware of just how much he was sweating, and he forced himself to smile even wider than he had before. The inside of the station was even more crowded. With this many people, it would be easy for someone to stick a knife in him or do something with a wand. Even after studying his school books, he didn't have a real idea just what a wizard could do. He couldn't see anyone who looked like auras. If they were competent, they would look more like muggles than muggles. Their whole job was blending in, after all, and making sure everyone else blended in. Hermione stopped talking about magic. The last thing they wanted was to force someone to be obliviated. While Hermione's father got them both carts for their luggage, she stopped and turned toward him. "So, do you have everything you need for school?" she asked. "Not as much as I'd like," Harry admitted, "but I've got all the basics. I would have liked to have gotten an owl, though." Glancing around, he could see at least a dozen families carrying owls in cages, as well as other animals. He couldn't understand how the normal people around them didn't notice. Didn't it seem odd? "I read that they create a low-level confundus field here just for school days," Hermione said. "It keeps people slightly confused. They don't do it the other days because it would cause all kinds of problems. People getting on the wrong trains, getting lost, that kind of thing." Harry nodded. It had to be something like that because it didn't look like some of the families were even trying to be discreet. He could see families running straight into a wall up ahead and disappearing. Even given the normally accepting nature of Londoners, that normally would have drawn a lot of attention. "That's it, then?" he asked in a low voice. Hermione nodded. "I went through when nobody was looking. We went late just in case when we came last week. There wasn't a train then, of course. I'm excited to see what it looks like." "I would have thought they'd do something like flying carpets," Harry said, "or broomsticks." "Flying carpets are illegal in Britain," Hermione said. "And besides, do you really want to try carrying a lot of luggage on one? Can you imagine hundreds of flying carpets all heading for Scotland? It'd be a nightmare from a secrecy perspective." "Nobody thinks anything about a train," Harry said, considering, "and it's a lot more convenient than trying to balance a trunk on a broom, I guess." "It's been in operation since 1830, Hermione said, "but with magic, they've been able to keep it running like new." From what Harry had read, wizards had stolen the train from muggles using massive amounts of memory charms and other magics. He flinched despite himself as an older man rushed past him. The sheer numbers of people inside the station was a nightmare from the perspective of watching for attackers. "Maybe we should get going," Harry murmured. Hermione nodded. She turned to her parents and said, "I wish I could take you through, but it'd be too inconvenient for everyone, trying to go back when everyone else is going in," Hermione's father said. "We know. You've told us." Hermione lowered her voice. "Most wizards just disapparate once the train leaves. I can't wait to learn how to do that. I've wanted to teleport since I watched the Tomorrow People reruns when I was a child." At Harry's quizzical look, she said, "I'll tell you about it on the train." She turned to her parents and began hugging them. She had tears in her eyes, and they clearly felt the same. Hermione's father clapped Harry on the back. "Take good care of our little girl." "It seems more likely that she's going to take care of me," Harry said awkwardly. He had to force himself not to flinch as the older man's arm went over his shoulder. He wasn't really sure how to react to the obvious love and affection the Grangers were showing out in public. He'd never been hugged before, much less kissed. His only human contact had been Dudley's fists, or being punished. Still, he could see others around him doing the same thing, and so it only helped make his ruse more convincing. After a moment, he relaxed. The man withdrew just as Harry was getting used to the sensation. "Well, you two had better get going. You don't want to be late. From what that professor told us, we'd never be able to find the school on our own." Hermione didn't seem to want to let go of her mother. Someone jostled into Harry, and he felt a chill down his spine. They needed to get moving, or he'd be dead for sure. The last thing he wanted was to be murdered again. For all he knew, he was like a cat, except that maybe 2 extra lives was all he had. Maybe he had 3 or 7 or 10. Maybe he could permanently die by some method that hadn't been used on him yet. Whatever happened, he couldn't afford to take chances. As they approached the platform, Hermione said, "You have to take a bit of a run at it. If you move slow and just touch it, it seems solid, but with a little speed you'll go right through." She'd tried it the week before, so she'd know. Presumably she and her family had been told the trick by whoever had been sent to tell them about magic. Harry wondered if his aunt knew and why she hadn't told him. Of course, it had been 15 years or more since she would have been told, so she might not remember. A moment later, Hermione was pushing her way through the wall, and Harry took a deep breath and followed her through. As he stumbled through to the other side, Harry had a sense that he was walking into another world. Whereas on the other side, the wizards had made at least a token effort to fit in with the muggles around them. On this side, they'd changed into clothes they were more comfortable. It was like Diagon Alley all over again, except this time there were children everywhere. They were moving around and talking in high-pitched, shrill voices. Adults moved more sedately. This was making Harry anxious. The fast-moving younger children were coming in from all directions, and the sensation of quick movement out of the side of his vision made him jerk. It was only 2 red-haired twins throwing something through the air at each other. Harry reached up and wiped the sweat from his forehead. His hand felt sticky, and a moment later he realized that he'd wiped the makeup from his forehead. Hermione was staring at his forehead. "I'd wondered if you'd gotten cosmetic surgery to have it repaired," she said quietly, staring at the scar on his forehead. "I just didn't want to say anything." As if the Dursleys would shell out for cosmetic surgery. He was lucky they'd even bothered to get him glasses. The train was bigger than he would have thought. It had to be to carry hundreds of students. Harry found himself being impressed in spite of himself. It wasn't like a modern tram at all, and despite its age, it looked brand new. The sign said, "Hogwarts Express, 11 o'clock. "Maybe we should get on the train before the good seats are taken," he said. The first 2 compartments were already filled with students, some hanging out of the windows calling to their families. He could see an entire family of redheads staring at the scar on his head. He winced and grabbed Hermione. "I've had too many people gawk at it. That's why I cover it up with makeup." It was a lie, of course. He'd never even given people a chance to gawk at it, although he could see several people in the crowd gawking at it now. They pushed forward, and he and Hermione managed to pull their suitcases onto the train. They dragged them to the first empty compartment they could find, and together they managed to wrestle the luggage into the overhead bins. Harry felt exhausted as they finally sat down, less from the exertion with the luggage and more from the emotional stress of having had to walk through the gauntlet. He'd felt like he was creeping through a minefield, but for whatever reason no one had tried to kill him. "I read about the prophecy, you know," Hermione said, "and we got a subscription to the wizarding newspaper. There was an article about your attending this year." She pulled out a paper, and Harry saw a picture of him as a baby. His scar was starkly visible. "The last thing I want is to get famous," Harry said, "or think about the prophecy. I think prophecies are rubbish anyway." "Well, they do always seem to be written in a way that they can be met in multiple ways. You never hear about a prophecy saying that someone is going to be defeated on June 22nd, Harry said, smirking. "Well," Hermione said, "if I heard I was going to be defeated that day, I'd just call in sick." Harry nodded. "I think it's nonsense anyway. Do they really think I defeated the Dark Lord as a baby?" "You call him the Dark Lord?" Hermione asked. "I thought only Death Eaters did that." Harry flushed. "I couldn't find out what his name actually is. I'm not going to run around calling him you-know-who like they do in the books." Hermione smirked and leaned closer to him. "You want to know his name? I know what it is. It's—" A round-faced boy stuck his head in the door and said, "Have either of you seen my toad?" Harry stared at the boy for a long moment. He couldn't for the life of him understand why anyone would want a toad. Owls were useful, and cats were good for petting, at least when they weren't clawing and biting, like Miss Fig's many cats when they were in a mood. A toad didn't seem useful at all, and they didn't seem like they'd be good companions. "Haven't seen it," Harry said. "Let's go help him," Hermione said. "It'll give us a chance to see the rest of the train, and we might even make a new friend." Harry hesitated. The other students would see his scar soon enough, and he could feel the train beginning to move. There wasn't much chance that the adults had allowed Death Eaters on the train. "All right," he said. It was a relief to finally not have to worry about his life every second. According to what he'd read, Hogwarts was the safest place in all of Wizarding Britain. He should be safe enough until it was time to come home. The thought of finally being able to relax made him smile. He said, "Sure, let's go." Finding the toad wasn't easy. Most of the students seemed absorbed in their own conversations, and few of them seemed interested until they glanced up at the scar on his head. Harry made sure to let Hermione and the new boy to do all the talking, even as he kept well back. The last thing he wanted was to have a lot of questions. One redhead was in a compartment with his brothers. "I want to go meet Harry Potter," he was saying as Hermione opened the door to the compartment. Harry quickly stepped back out of sight before the trio could see him. Some of the looks the older students gave them weren't friendly, especially the ones wearing green. Harry felt a little uncomfortable around them, and he was starting to feel like this was a mistake. A white-haired boy and two goons brushed by him, barely giving him a look as they headed toward the back of the train. "Out of the way, mudblood!" he snarled at Hermione, who seemed confused. Harry stepped aside quickly, letting the three of them pass. "What's a mudblood?" he asked. Hermione shrugged uncomfortably. It didn't sound very nice. Eventually they found the toad in the boys' loo. "Thanks, mate. I don't think I'd have found Trevor on my own," the boy, who'd finally introduced himself as Neville Longbottom, said. With a name like Longbottom, Harry suspected that he had to have been bullied, unless other wizard names were just as outlandish. "It's not a problem," Harry said. "Why don't you and Hermione head back and I'll catch up with you in a bit." He wanted a chance to see if he could recover his scar with the makeup, even though almost everyone had seen it by now. "It's all right if I sit with you?" Neville asked. The boy seemed harmless enough. A toad didn't seem like the kind of pet a Death Eater would have anyway. Maybe a snake or a hawk to peck out people's eyes. Harry wondered if he would be allowed to keep a hawk as a pet, but decided that it probably wasn't worth the effort. With his luck, it'd peck his eyes out and he'd end up back in his cupboard. Or worse, he wouldn't die and would have to go around with a distinct lack of eyes. After Hermione and Neville left, Harry checked the makeup on his forehead, hoping to get it back into a semblance of concealing his scar. He finally had to give it up as a lost cause. He washed it away as well as he could, and he finally began heading back toward his compartment. Stepping from one train compartment to the other made him a little nervous. The ground was flying by quickly, and it looked like all it would take would be a strong wind to throw someone off the train. He was almost back to his compartment, opening the door to the outside, when he heard someone rushing him from behind. Harry felt himself being shoved outside, and he struggled to grab the rail. But whoever it was that was pushing him was a lot bigger and stronger. There wasn't even a chance to see who it was. Harry was grabbing for the rail and holding on for dear life. Someone grabbed his hands and wrenched them open. Before he could even scream, he was pushed over the edge. He was pulled under the wheels of the train, and there was a moment of horrific pain before everything went black. Chapter 7. Mandatory. Waking in darkness, for a moment Harry thought he was back in his cupboard. It took a moment before he realized he was in his bed in his room. Although he had a window, he'd had to cover it at night in order to sleep. After years of total darkness, it was hard to sleep with the light shining through the window. He rolled out of bed and staggered for the door. He moved quietly in the darkness through the hallway and into the lavatory. Not bothering to turn on the light, he quietly retched into the toilet. His mind kept flashing back to the pain as he'd rolled under the wheels of the train, to being pushed. From what Hermione told him, there weren't many adults on the train, only the witch running concessions and the driver. That meant that either an adult had managed to hide somehow on the train, or one of his fellow students had outright murdered him. Either way, any sense of security he might have had was gone. Hogwarts wasn't going to be any safer than being at home, less so in many ways. At least here he had anonymity. He closed his eyes and hoped that there might be some way to refuse. He was in his room, which meant that this was after he'd received his Hogwarts letter and after his trip to Diagon Alley. Aunt Petunia might be upset at the loss of £300, but she hadn't really wanted him to go to Hogwarts anyway. Maybe there was a way to rescind his acceptance and simply go to public school. Living with the Dursleys wasn't that bad, especially since they'd come to an accommodation. He grimly cleaned the toilet as well as he could, after finally reaching to turn on the light. Staring at himself in the mirror, Harry noted that he looked pale and haggard. While his body was whole, and there was no sign of the broken bones and mangled flesh that he'd experienced for a moment, the memories still remained. He remembered every death, and those memories were more intense than any of the others. This last death had been more intense than the others, although the Crucio spell the man had used on him had hurt almost as badly. He couldn't keep going through this, or he would go insane. Harry went back to bed, and sleep was a long time coming. He had nightmares about being ground beneath the wheels of a train, even as men in robes stabbed him over and over again and laughed maniacally. It wasn't until he woke the next morning that he discovered that he'd lost a month this time. All the goodwill that he'd slowly developed with his aunt and uncle over the preceding month was gone. Furthermore, he'd have a month to obsess and revisit what had happened on the train. He'd have to do everything over again, and he wasn't looking forward to it. It had been easier this time to gain the approval of his aunt and uncle. He'd seen what buttons to push the last time, and he'd managed to find other things that they approved of this time. His aunt and uncle were easier to manipulate than he'd imagined. Of course, he couldn't manipulate them the way Dudley did. Dudley didn't even have to make an effort. Harry had to do it gradually and in small steps. If he went too far, they simply assumed that he was mocking them, and they punished him. He managed to get their permission to work outside the home 3 days a week if he gave them half the money he earned. He went over his school books again, but he'd already read them all several times by this point, and he was getting bored. Finally, he became desperate enough to phone Hermione. She managed to convince her parents to come to Surrey for the weekend. Although it was only 56 kilometres, it would take almost an hour to make the drive due to traffic. Hermione brought some of the books that she'd bought, ones that Harry didn't have yet, and she let him borrow them with the promise that he'd return them when they reached Hogwarts. Harry was stunned. No one had ever done anything like that for him, and having the books would give him something to do other than stay in his room or stare at the wall. The Grangers had even taken Harry out to dinner. It was a fast food place, but Harry had been touched that they'd been willing to buy him food when they didn't have to. His aunt and uncle had always seemed to begrudge every bite that he'd eaten, and yet here these near strangers were willing to buy him a meal. They'd wanted to talk to his aunt and uncle about Hogwarts, but he'd made the excuse that they were working late again. They'd settled on talking to Harry about what his expectations of the school were. Harry had lied, of course. He doubted that Hermione's experiences at school would be anything like his were likely to be. He imagined 6 years of assassination attempts, of never knowing a moment's safety. It made him want to crawl back into the safety of his cupboard and never come out. The problem with writing a letter to the school was that he didn't know how to reach them. He hadn't been able to afford an owl, and he had no idea what the address was. He suspected that Muggle post wouldn't reach them anyway, and that trying would be a violation of the secrecy that the wizards worked so hard to maintain. Talking to the Grangers, however, he learned that there was a way for Muggle parents to write to the school, and they were helpful enough to give him the address and what he was supposed to write. He went home, and even though he knew it would possibly mean someone from the school would come to the house, enraging his aunt and uncle, he wrote a letter saying that he'd changed his mind about coming to Hogwarts. Despite all of this, he studied the new books Hermione had given him, did household chores, and he did occasional work for people in the neighborhood, although he was careful not to be outside where he could be seen very often. He mostly worked in the mornings when his uncle was at work and his aunt went shopping. It meant that he was around when they needed him in the evenings, and that his aunt didn't have to take him with her shopping. She felt safer with him not around, and when she felt safer, she was less irritable. The money he was giving them helped as well. He didn't always tell them when he'd gotten a tip for doing good work. But as far as he was concerned, what they didn't know wouldn't hurt them. So he was surprised when he returned to their house after a job raking leaves and digging up weeds down the street to see an angry-looking man at the door. He was wearing all black, a frock coat and a cravat with long trousers. In some ways, he looked like a Puritan minister from a historical show on the telly. Vernon disliked that kind of show, but Petunia liked the fire and brimstone sermons. This man wasn't even trying to hide what he was. Only the fact that he was knocking loudly at the door instead of breaking in kept Harry from running the other way. He'd been expecting a visitor from Hogwarts after all. "Can I help you?" he asked cautiously. His grip tightened around the trowel in his right hands. Under the right circumstances, the small shovel could be used as a weapon, even if it wouldn't be very effective. He wasn't sure whether it was better to close the distance with the man or to stay away. With a Muggle criminal, keeping his distance was obvious. The man was taller and stronger than he was, and as he'd seen, the Dark Lord's followers were willing to use knives. On the other hand, he had no idea how far a wand could reach, and from this distance he had no way to do anything offensive. He chose to err on the side of caution, keeping his distance. "Mr. Potter," the man said, his face impassive, although he looked as though he wanted to say something much less flattering. Harry could see the man glance up at the scar on his forehead for the briefest of moments, and as he did, Harry took a step back. Letting wizards see his scar had been what had gotten him killed at least twice. "Who are you?" Harry asked. He took a step back. Diving into the bushes might not provide much protection, but it would be better than nothing. "Professor Severus Snape," the man said. "I am here to discuss your attempt to disenroll yourself from Hogwarts before you even attended a single class." Harry stared at the man. Attendance at Hogwarts isn't mandatory, at least that's what the books say. Given that, I'm not sure why you're even here. A simple letter would have sufficed. Muggle post preferred. "Perhaps this would be better discussed inside with your guardians," the man said, gritting his teeth. "My aunt and uncle aren't here," Harry said. "With half the wizarding world wanting to murder me, I hope you understand why I wouldn't want to let a strange wizard into our home." "Besides," he said, he leaned his rake against the wall, "my aunt and uncle don't care for magic. They'd be upset with me if I allowed your sort in the house." "My sort?" the man asked. He'd gone quiet. Harry smirked. "Wizards, people who murdered my parents and who are looking to murder me and my entire family. You can understand how they might be a little cautious about who they'd want to let in the house." There was a strange expression on the man's face at the mention of his mother, but it vanished so quickly, Harry wasn't sure it had ever existed in the first place. Pulling his wand, the man looked startled when Harry dropped behind the bushes. Harry shoved his way through the bushes and made his way to a gap between the bushes and the wall. He was small and thin, and he was able to crawl quickly. Hopefully the cover would make him harder to hit, although he hoped that the man didn't simply set the bushes on fire. He crawled towards the edge of the house, hoping to round the corner where he'd be able to run. Looking up, he saw the man staring down at him. Stupefy! How long it was before Harry woke, he wasn't sure, but he was in his aunt and uncle's living room sitting on a chair. His neck hurt, presumably from the angle he'd been lying at. The man who'd stunned him, Snape something or other, was sitting across from him drinking tea. "You seem to be under the misapprehension that you have a choice as to whether to go or not," the man said. "Hogwarts isn't mandatory. Homeschooling is allowed for people who have wizards in their family or who are able to afford tutors," the man said. He glanced around. "I gather you do not fit in either of those categories." "I could apply to another school," Harry said. "Maybe one outside of Britain." Finding a school where no wanted to kill him sounded like a great idea. Maybe he'd go to school in America or wherever Durmstrang was. "The time for registration has already passed," the man said. "You won't be able to get into another school until next year at the earliest." He hesitated. "And if you think that moving out of the country will take you beyond the Dark Lord's reach, you are sadly mistaken." Harry froze. According to Hermione, only Death Eaters called whoever it was the Dark Lord. Everyone else called him you-know-who. But if the man was a servant of the ones trying to kill him, why wasn't he doing anything now? The man must have read something in Harry's expression, because he snapped, "If I meant harm to you or yours, I wouldn't have been able to find this house." "What?" Harry asked, taken off guard. "There are wards around this house that make wizards who wish you harm unable to find it," the man said, "as well as providing other protections." "Even more reason for me not to leave then," Harry said. "Anonymity is my only protection, and once my face is out there, that's it." "Hogwarts is the best protected place in all of Wizarding Britain." "Better than right here," Harry shot back. "I'll be going to school with the children of the people who want me dead. At least here I only have to deal with people who want to kill my social life." "The Dark Lord's followers haven't tried to find you because they knew you'd be coming this year," Snape said. "If you do not, they'll be looking for you seriously." "Good luck," Harry said. "How long do you think it would take a Muggle investigator to find you?" Snape asked, leaning forward. "And you'd have to go to school sometimes. It would be easy to snatch you from whatever Muggle school you found and change the Muggles' memories so that you simply never showed up." "So my alternative is to go to a school where they'll know where I am," Harry said. "It doesn't exactly inspire confidence." They argued back and forth, but ultimately Harry was forced to conclude that the wizards and their politics wouldn't allow him to skip school. Half the wizarding world had their hopes resting on him, and the other half wanted to strangle him. Both sides wanted him at Hogwarts. If he refused, his family would simply be charmed into forcing him to go. Harry finally agreed to go. His aunt would be home soon, and he didn't want to deal with the fallout that would cause. For some reason, the man didn't seem particularly in a hurry to see his aunt either. Most of the school officials, in Harry's experience, would have insisted on talking to her, but this man left quickly, banishing his teacup with a flick of his wand. He was trapped. He was going to Hogwarts whether he wanted to or not. Chapter 8. Sorting. "I found a toad in the lavatory," Harry said. He'd insisted that Hermione wait outside while he checked his makeup. Oddly enough, he'd been less anxious this time while moving through the crowd. Knowing that they were planning to kill him on the train made the platform outside less anxiety-provoking. Why would anyone want a toad? Hermione stared at the creature curiously. Holding it on his lap, Harry had to admit that the creature was rather amusing. It probably would get tedious after a while, though. "We can ask around later and see if anyone's missing their toad." Harry idly stroked the back of the toad, calming it. Hermione was silent for a long moment. "Harry, I read some things about you. I didn't want to talk about it in front of my parents, but—" Scowling, Harry said, "If you don't want to be seen with me, I can understand. We don't have to talk after we get there." If he was courageous, he'd tell her to leave now, but the last thing he wanted to do was to be alone on this train. "What? No, I just wanted to say how sorry I was about your parents and about how the people in the papers are treating you." Harry glanced up at Hermione. She seemed sincere. He wondered how she could look so unconcerned. Maybe the implications had escaped her. He had a target on his back, and anyone who was close to him might get caught in the crossfire. The smart thing to do would be to stay as far away from him as possible. If he was a better person, he'd make her go away for her own good. Hermione was the first friend he'd ever made. Her family was the first people to ever treat him decently. He owed her more than to let her get hurt because of his own problems. "Thanks," he said, hating himself. "Do you think it's true? That I'm some kind of savior?" Harry shook his head. "It doesn't matter. As long as the rest of the world thinks that's what I am, it's going to affect my life." "That's why you cover it up?" Hermione asked, glancing up at his forehead. "Among other reasons," Harry said shortly. The door opened suddenly, a boy sticking his head through. "Have you seen a toad? Trevor." "I found him in the loo," Harry said. "We were going to start looking for his owner when the train started." The train began moving with a jerk. "Would you like to join us?" Harry asked. The more witnesses he had, the less likely anyone would be to try anything. "I left my luggage in another compartment," the boy said hesitantly. "We'd be glad to have you," Harry said. He forced himself to smile. Longbottom was too small to be the person who had forced him over the rail. No matter what happened, he wasn't leaving the compartment until the train reached its destination. Once Neville returned with his luggage, Harry turned and locked the door. At the looks from the others, he shrugged. Everybody should have found their compartments by now. The door rattled behind him, and Harry winced. "Have you seen Harry Potter?" A voice came from outside the compartment. It sounded like the redhead, although after a month Harry couldn't be sure. A moment later, he heard murmuring voices. There were shouts outside, and the sound of someone hitting the wall, even as someone else shouted, "Blood traitor!" Harry smirked as they heard the sound of rushing feet in the corridors as older voices yelled down the hallway. "Like I said, everybody should already have found their places." The rest of the trip was oddly anticlimactic. 8 hours with the other two should have been a trial, but Neville Longbottom was an endless source of knowledge about the wizarding world. He'd been raised a pureblood, and he seemed more than happy to answer Hermione's endless questions. There had been trips to the loo for the other two. Harry had insisted on going along with Neville, and he'd been sweating the entire way. He wondered if there was a spell to make it possible to not have to use the bathroom. Neville had showed them some wizarding games to pass the time, and Hermione had showed them some of the books she'd gotten from her 3rd trip to Diagon Alley. He'd given her money to make a few purchases for him, including a book about poisons and a bezoar. While he doubted anyone would openly attack him at school, at least as long as he was with other people, he could easily see poison being used. According to his texts, bezoars weren't good for everything, but they were better than nothing. Neville finally told him the Dark Lord's name, although he seemed as though he was about to pass out as he said it. Voldemort, French for flee from death. The irony of that wasn't lost on Harry. As much as Harry tried to flee from death, it always seemed to find him. Presumably the other wizard didn't have the same problem. It didn't seem likely that it was the man's given name anyway. Nobody named their child Voldemort Jones, after all, although given that he was sitting with someone named Longbottom, he might be mistaken. They talked a little about the house system in Hogwarts. Neville assumed he would be in Hufflepuff, believing it was the house for people who weren't good enough for the other houses. Hermione hoped for Gryffindor, although she rather thought she might be placed in Ravenclaw. Harry had no idea where he was going to be placed. He didn't care, as long as he wasn't going to have to sleep near people who wanted to kill him. All in all, although Harry kept waiting for something horrible to happen, nothing ever did. Maybe Snape had done something to beef up security, or maybe what had happened the first time had simply been a crime of opportunity once the perpetrator had realized who he was. Either way, Harry felt better once the train had stopped and they had all slipped into their robes. He and Neville first, and then followed by Hermione as they stepped out into the corridor. He felt nervous again as the crowd surged around him. It would be easy for someone to push a knife into his back in the press of the crowd and get away without anyone seeing what happened. They managed to get out onto a small, dark platform and then out onto the grass. Harry made sure to push his way to the edge of the crowd, although he shivered in the cool night air. A light appeared, and a moment later a huge figure appeared. He was twice as tall as an average man and 3 times as wide, and he had a beard that looked like it could host an entire flock of birds. The man looked as though he was looking for someone. Harry's paranoia suggested that it was him, so he carefully bent down as though he'd dropped something. "First years, follow me," the man said. He sounded disappointed for some reason. The man led them down a dark, narrow path. It was steep, and Harry wondered if he was going to put his foot in a hole and twist his ankle. If he fell and broke his neck, he would not be amused. They walked for a time with everyone oddly silent. As they rounded a bend, everyone gasped as the sight of the still, black lake and the castle beyond. Even Harry, as bitter and anxious as he had become, wasn't immune to the sight before him. For a moment he forgot to worry about dying and simply stopped to take in the sights. 4 to a boat, the man said. Harry wasn't certain he was entirely human. Given his size, how could he be? He and Hermione and Neville all scrambled to get into a boat. Harry saw the redhead and the boy with the white hair arguing with loud whispers, even as everyone else scrambled to get into their own boats. A girl named Lisa Turpin joined them on the boat moments before it began to glide across the lake on its own. Staring at the water, Harry was particularly careful to hold on to the sides of the boat, even as he kept a wary eye on his companions. "Are you afraid of the water?" Neville asked quietly. Harry shook his head. "I'm not particularly anxious to meet the giant squid." Neville paled. Truthfully, while the whole thing seemed solemn and impressive, it didn't seem very safe to Harry. The red-haired and white-haired boy and his 2 followers had argued long enough that there weren't any boats left. They were riding together, and Harry could see the boat rocking in the moonlight. How many of the students couldn't swim? Given how impulsive some members of his age group were, he could hear the sounds of a splash as the other boat turned over. A moment later, he saw the boat right itself and 4 screaming boys being deposited back into their boat by massive tentacles. "Huh," Harry said. He suddenly felt a little better about the trip across the lake. He relaxed a little and decided to try to enjoy himself. The trip across the lake was over all too soon. The stern-faced woman introduced herself as Professor McGonagall moments after scowling at the 4 boys who were dripping water all over the flagstones. She pulled her wand, and Harry tensed, but all she did was cast some sort of drying charm that still didn't do anything for the boys' hair. They scowled at each other even as the woman began her speech. They used flaming torches instead of electric lights, and Harry wondered if they were magical, or if they were some sort of safety hazard. It did lend the massive hall a distinctive look. She mentioned something about houses, but Harry was distracted. He'd made his way to the edge of the group, and he was keeping his back to the wall. These were all first years, and he didn't really expect an 11-year-old to try to assassinate him, but he'd been wrong before. The sounds of screams made him flinch. It took him a moment to see the ghosts floating by. Unlike the others, he wasn't particularly bothered by them. He only wanted to worry about things that could actually kill him. And at least according to his first-year books, ghosts couldn't. Shortly after that, they were led into an even greater hall, where they were faced with a singing hat. Harry was nonplussed. He wasn't sure that he'd want to wear something that was sentient, or even that. Just seemed to be, The whole thing seemed a little silly. He glanced behind the singing hat. There was a table of adults. He assumed that they were professors. Snape was among them, glowering down at the student body, along with a man who looked a little like Gandalf, a woman with what looked like magnifying glasses for spectacles, and a chill of horror went down his spine, and it was all he could do not to collapse to the floor. The man who'd murdered him the first time was sitting at the table along with all of the other adults, smiling genially as though he wasn't a mass-murdering terrorist. He was wearing a turban, presumably to cover the face at the back of his head. Hermione glanced at him, a look of concern on her face. Harry forced his expression back to being neutral, even though he had to hold his hands behind his back to conceal the fact that they were trembling. The odds were slim that the man was going to murder him in front of hundreds of other people, not unless he was planning to begin his new takeover immediately. He'd wait until they were alone. Harry felt like he was in a daze. The hat sang some sort of song that barely registered with him, and they began calling names. Hermione and the red-haired boy were chosen as Gryffindors, as was Neville. The white-haired boy and his two cronies went to Slytherin. He didn't know any of the others or really care. His name was called twice before he noticed. He rubbed the makeup off his forehead as he made the long walk to the seat with the hat on top of it. He felt like he was walking to his execution. He carefully didn't look at the man in the turban, reminding himself that the man didn't know that Harry knew who and hat he was. As long as that continued to be true, Harry had a minimum of protection. Harry reluctantly picked up the hat and turned to face the gathered children. Turning his back to the man in the turban was one of the hardest things he had ever done. He felt as though he had a bullseye on his back, and he found himself waiting to be shot. As he placed the hat on his head, Harry wondered how many other heads the hat had been on, and exactly how hygienic it was to wear a hat that had been on at least 800 heads. They weren't even supposed to share combs at his old school, not since one of his classmates had gotten lice and spread it to half the class. His aunt and uncle had somehow blamed him for it. "I don't have lice." The voice in his head startled him so much that he pulled the hat off his head and began to throw it to the ground. An elderly hand on his arm caused him to look up at Professor McGonagall for a moment. He scowled and put the hat back on his head. "As I was saying, I am cleaned magically every year, much better than any Muggle techniques could manage." "I'm not sure all of my classmates from this year look particularly clean," Harry mumbled, "especially that white-haired kid. He looks like he uses a lot of grease in his hair." "You are the one who put makeup on my brim," the hat said. "Sorry," Harry muttered, glancing at his hand. It did feel greasy. He wiped it on the edge of his robes. "On to business," the hat said. "You have a fine mind and plenty of talent. You had courage once, although much less now." "If you're looking in my head, you know that's not my fault," Harry said. This time he managed to simply think it without speaking, and the hat still seemed to understand him. If magic could read minds, then he was going to have a harder time than he thought keeping himself safe. Any place but Slytherin, Harry thought. Gryffindor would be fine, Ravenclaw, even Hufflepuff. Hufflepuff might be the safest option. "Oh, that wouldn't do at all," the voice said. "Hufflepuffs value loyalty and friendship. You've never had anyone to be loyal to until just recently, and even though you've recently found a friend, you didn't hesitate to put her at risk for your own safety." "Ravenclaw, then?" Harry asked. "I study." The truth was he'd been studying more over the past month than he'd ever studied in his life. "But you don't care about learning for its own sake." The hat sounded almost disappointed. "You only care about how it will help you get to your goal." "Gryffindor?" Harry asked cautiously. "Once, perhaps it would have been a good fit for you. I don't tell everyone this, but sorting isn't so much about the traits someone has as much as the traits someone values." The hat continued. "Hufflepuffs value loyalty and friendship. Ravenclaws value knowledge. Gryffindors value bravery, but they also value seeming brave. They want glory above everything. Can you truthfully tell me you value glory? Do you care what anyone else thinks of you? Do you even care about courage?" To anyone else, Harry would have lied, but this hat was looking inside his head. "No," he said after a long pause. "Recently your life has been about a single driving ambition, about surviving. You are cunning and devious and willing to use others to accomplish your goals. Your mind has more than a few similarities to the one who is now trying to kill you." "You sorted Voldemort," Harry said out loud. It came out louder than he'd intended, ringing across the hall. The crowd nearest to him gasped and pulled back. "I tell no secrets of those whose charge I am given," the hat said. "If there is ambiguity, I often allow a student a choice, but in your case, there is no ambiguity." "Has to be Slytherin," the hat called. The sense of walking to his execution worsened as Harry slowly pulled the hat off and faced the silent crowd in front of him. Chapter 9. Sleeping. There had been cheers for the other students, but for Harry there was dead silence. He grimaced and carefully set the hat down. He walked toward the Slytherin table and carefully sat down without a word. The other first years almost imperceptibly pulled back from him, and it seemed that none of them could stop staring. Looking up, Harry could see that even Professor McGonagall seemed at a loss for words. After a seemingly endless time, she eventually went on to the sorting of the last two students. Harry felt miserable and misused. It wasn't his fault that he was trapped in a situation that required him to be cunning. He couldn't help but look before he leapt. There were pitfalls everywhere. He was sure that he could have fit in one of the other houses. He could learn to love having friends. He simply was too new to it to know exactly what to do yet. He glanced over at Hermione, who had a sympathetic look on her face. He couldn't see Neville. Harry stared at the table, barely noticing when the headmaster stood to give some sort of speech. He was startled to see food appear on the table, more food than he'd seen in his entire life. While the other students talked openly, the students around him seemed subdued. Harry could feel them glancing at him, and he grimaced. A moment later, he felt a presence settle beside him. He glanced over and saw a gaunt, dead-eyed ghost covered in silver blood. Harry shrugged and began eating, even as the other students around him reacted to the ghost. He didn't have time to worry about phantoms. "We weren't expecting to have a Potter sitting at this table," the ghost said finally. Harry chewed his food for a moment, considering what he was going to say. "I can't say I expected to be here, but I can't say the hat was wrong." This end of the table mostly consisted of first years, while the older students were further back. Harry suspected that he had the most to fear from the 6th and 7th years. They would know the most magic and wouldn't be risking as much of their magical education by trying to hurt him. "You think you are cunning enough to be a Slytherin?" "Try me," Harry said. He smiled mirthlessly. "There's a prophecy about me. If it's right, I'm going to be a very dangerous person someday. Probably best to head off any problems. I've got a very, very long memory, and I hold grudges." The ghost glanced around the table. All the others nearby seemed to be listening intently, and some of them were pale. The ghost nodded. "I can see why you were placed here." Harry smiled mirthlessly. He chatted with the ghost, who introduced himself as the Bloody Baron. He supposed that as a ghost there wasn't much that could be done to him. His classmates were in an unpleasant position. Harry suspected that at least some of them would have been happy to have been friends with him. However, with Voldemort's people being active, none of them could afford to be seen as being friendly to him. There were too many people in their house who were doubtlessly reporting to their parents. Some of the parents were Death Eaters. Being friendly with Harry was a good way to have friends and relatives murdered, at least if the histories Harry had read from the last war were still true. This was like his experience in school with Dudley keeping anyone from being his friend, only infinitely worse. Harry glanced behind him. Hermione was talking to other people around her, and she seemed happy at least. The red-haired boy was glaring at Harry with a look of betrayal on his face. Considering that Harry had never met the boy, certainly not in this timeline, he couldn't see what the boy had to feel betrayed about. The rest of the meal concluded in silence, and afterwards the headmaster made an announcement about avoiding the third floor on pain of certain death, as well as warning about the forbidden forest. Harry felt his stomach drop. He already had an insane professor waiting to murder him the moment he turned his back. Some mysterious danger on the third floor and a forest nearby filled with horrible monsters. He wondered if he would survive the night, much less live to finish all 7 years of school. If this was the safest place in all wizarding Britain, he wondered what an average place was like. Did they have trolls in the toilet or giant snakes in the drains? Didn't this bother anyone? None of the other students around him seemed all that concerned. In his old school, they would have evacuated everyone if a homeless man had wandered onto the school grounds. Parents certainly would have withdrawn students if they heard about certain death on the third floor. Harry was still grumbling to himself when the entire room was led by the headmaster in a horrible rendition of the school song. Apparently, music wasn't one of the subjects taught here. An older student, apparently a prefect, gathered them up and led them out of the great hall. They were led down a set of stairs. Apparently, the Slytherin common rooms were in the dungeons. Harry felt exhausted. Apparently, being in constant terror was wearing on the body, and he'd had a long day. They were led to a stone wall, and the prefect turned to them. "The password for this week will be Alpha Serpentis. Memorize it and don't let any member of another house hear about it. We haven't had anyone from another house break into our common rooms in the last 700 years, and I won't have it happen on my watch. It'll change every 2 weeks, and it'll be posted on the noteboard inside," he said. The wall opened up in front of them, and he led them into a short passage. It led into a room with greenish lamps and chairs. The ceiling was low, and there were windows apparently leading out to the lake. "You've been assigned rooms," the prefect said. "Your trunks have already been moved next to your assigned bed." Harry wondered how they'd moved all the trunks in the short time since the sorting. It had been less than an hour, and he hadn't seen any staff other than the professors. Professor Snape handles the punishments within Slytherin, and he is known for his creative punishments for those who prove to be an embarrassment to the house. I know better than to ask the lot of you to stay out of trouble. But you'd better not get caught. The prefect gestured, and a female prefect came to escort the girls away to their rooms. "The girls' rooms are off-limit to the boys. I don't suppose you care much about that now, but you will later," the prefect said, smirking. He led them through a small hallway into a circular room. There were 5 beds, and Harry's was the one farthest from the door. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. It would make it difficult for him to escape, but it also meant that an attacker from outside would have farther to go before they could attack him. "You should go to bed," the prefect said. "Class schedules will be handed out at breakfast tomorrow. Classes start at 9 and breakfast begins at 8. Although in the future, early risers will be able to get an abbreviated breakfast at 7:30. The boys around Harry groaned, although Harry couldn't understand their problem. He was up by 6 a.m. at the Dursley house in order to shower and start making breakfast, so it would be ready by 7. Sometimes he had to get up earlier if he knew he had extra chores. Even during the summer, his aunt insisted that he keep to the same schedule, claiming that he didn't need to be lazy even when his cousins slept in until 10. They had late breakfasts on those days to accommodate his cousin, even though this left Harry hungry. The prefect glanced at Harry and said, "Good luck and welcome to Hogwarts." As the door closed, Harry turned to face the other boys. The white-haired boy was flanked by his 2 cronies, and a black boy was standing off to the side. "I'm sure you all know who I am," Harry said. "Who are you?" "Draco Malfoy," the white-haired boy said, "and this is Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle." Harry wondered if the later 2 could speak for themselves. They didn't look to be particularly cunning, although maybe they simply wished they were. The other boy was tall and dark-skinned. He said, "Blaise Zabini, pleased to meet you." "Are you?" Harry asked. "How much do you know about the prophecy?" Harry asked. "My father says it's all a load of hogwash," Draco said, "as though a kid our age would be a threat to the Dark Lord." Harry smiled grimly. "And yet they act like I am a threat. Can you think of a reason why?" "Because old people are crazy," Goyle asked. "Yes, actually, but sometimes they're right," Harry said. He headed for his bed. "You know, if I end up dead in here, half the wizarding world is going to be after your heads, right?" The others stared at him silently. "And if you try to kill me and fail, you'll be stuck in here sleeping with me," Harry said. He smiled, although the smile didn't reach his eyes. "The hat told me that my mind is very much like Voldemort's, and what does he do to those who cross him?" They all started, although he couldn't tell if it was at his use of the name or at what he'd said. "Whatever you do to me, I'll find a way to hurt you," Harry said. He hesitated. "I know you can't be seen as being my friends, but being my enemy wouldn't be very bright either." With that, he began undressing for bed, and the others followed suit. Harry would have thought that the greenish light that was coming from the windows would keep him up, like the lights outside his aunt and uncle's house. Instead, he found them to be oddly soothing. After the day he'd had, he was exhausted. As he fell asleep, he wondered if he would wake up again in his bed at the Dursley house. To his surprise, he survived the night. At breakfast, he discovered that his classmates had decided that the simplest way to deal with him was to ignore him. It was the safest thing they could do under the circumstances. Although he'd worried about the Slytherins, he actually heard more comments and received the most dirty looks from the Gryffindors. Apparently, he'd been expected to be sorted into their house, and they saw it as a personal affront that he hadn't been. The class schedule was simple. All he'd really have to worry about was flying class on Thursday and potions on Friday, both of which were held in concert with the Gryffindors. Other than that, he'd simply have to avoid them in the halls, and he should be fine. His first class, History of Magic, was a monumental disappointment. Harry began to wonder seriously if the ghost teaching the class was trying to bore them to death. If the rest of Hogwarts' curriculum was this boring, Harry couldn't see why the students wouldn't just all move to France or possibly America. Anything would be better, although at least there were no attempts to kill him. On his way out the door, Harry felt his legs being pulled out from under him. He saw a group of Gryffindor boys snickering nearby, with one sheathing his wand. He scowled. On top of attempts on his life, he'd have to deal with garden-variety bullying. He'd thought he was done with that when he left Dudley behind. It had been the one thing he'd been looking forward to about going to this castle-shaped death trap. Making sure to never be alone, Harry made his way to Charms class, which was led by a professor who was short enough to be a goblin. This class he found much more interesting. Although they weren't allowed to do any practical magic, Professor Flitwick did begin to teach them the basics of wand movements and a little about the theory behind the pronunciation of spells. At home, Harry had always been at the mercy of the bigger, stronger boys. No matter how hard he'd tried, he'd never been able to fight back in any way that mattered. However, trained wizard duelists were known for being able to take on multiple opponents at once. Magic was the great equalizer. A child the size of Hermione could defeat a man who weighed 100 kilos, assuming she knew the right spells. What he learned in class was going to be the basis for defending himself from Voldemort, his Death Eaters, and even from bullies in other houses in his own. The problem was going to be learning fast enough, Harry thought, as he was dodging jinxes from another set of bullies. The Slytherins hadn't joined in so far at least, but Harry suspected that it was only a matter of time. Harry vowed to remember everyone who'd attacked him and to find some way to get back at them. Talking to Dudley had never made a difference. The only thing that had stopped his bullying had been fear. The only way Harry would be safe from day to day was if people feared to attack him. Herbology was interesting, but didn't seem as useful. Harry had studied poisons a little, as he'd feared that would be the easiest way to murder him. He kept his bezoar with him religiously. Herbology didn't seem to focus on poisons or even plants that could be used to attack people. It seemed perfectly pleasant, and Harry liked the professor much as he liked Flitwick. Neither seemed likely to try to murder him, although the woman would seem to have the skill to make a competent poisoner. Astronomy made him anxious. Being at the top of a tall tower during the middle of the night seemed like a recipe for being pushed off the tower while no one was looking. He made sure to get a telescope as far from the edges as possible, and he was careful on the stairs coming back. He couldn't see how astronomy was going to help him on his quest to survive, although once he'd realized he wasn't about to be murdered, he'd relaxed and enjoyed looking at the stars. Part of him wished that he'd be able to simply lie on a blanket out staring up at the stars without a worry in the world. If he'd been in Gryffindor, he was sure he'd have had friends. People wouldn't have been afraid to talk to him. He'd have been able to spend time with Neville and Hermione every day. He wasn't even sure if they'd want to speak to him now, and he hadn't had a chance to find them. Undoubtedly, the other Gryffindors were going to pressure them to stay away from him. In a perfect world, he'd be able to relax, letting Hermione do his homework and spending time with Neville, playing whatever it was that wizards played. It wasn't until he stepped into his defense against the dark arts class that he realized that he'd be taught by Voldemort himself, or at least the man who hosted him. Chapter 10, Potions. Unlike Gryffindors, Slytherins were content to wait for the best time to attack an enemy. Harry had to remind himself of that as they filed into the classroom under the watchful eye of the man who had Voldemort in his head. The entire room reeked of garlic. There was an undertone of rot, a smell which had been barely noticeable the first time Harry had been killed by the man. It was stronger now, even if the scent of garlic almost overpowered it. Apparently, hosting Voldemort inside your head wasn't very healthy. Harry couldn't imagine the kind of violation it would be to have his worst enemy inside his head. You may address me as Professor Quirrell, the man said, as the last student took their seats. And this is defense against the dark arts. The stutter had to be an affectation, doubtless to make the man seem less dangerous, just as the garlic had to be there to cover the smell. Harry wondered if Voldemort's face was a little like having a zombie sewn to the back of your head. He wondered if Voldemort got sweaty inside that turban. The idea that Voldemort might get sweat in his eyes and not be able to do anything about it made Harry smirk. Quirrell had been ignoring him, but he glanced toward Harry, who suddenly felt sudden pain radiating from his scar. The pain had begun just as Quirrell looked at him, and it receded when he looked away. The man hadn't even touched his wand, and he'd been able to cause pain without anyone noticing. Harry made an effort afterward to avoid meeting his eye, even as the lesson proved to be less than inspiring. The man told a story about battling a zombie, but with his maddening stutter, the story took twice as long as it should have. He told a nonsensical story about his turban, which none of the other students seemed skeptical about. Slytherins were supposed to be cunning and suspicious. Harry liked to think that even if he'd never met Quirrell before, he'd have been suspicious of him from the very beginning. He was glad to get out of the classroom, hurrying out without his usual caution, which was why he was caught by a spell. He felt his hair falling off his head, even as the Gryffindors snickered. The Slytherins smirked slightly as they passed by him, especially Draco Malfoy. Malfoy had looked offended at his speech the night before, and had been more obvious about ignoring him than any of the other Slytherins. Harry knew better than to rush to a lavatory to check his hair, not with Quirrell staring at him. Being alone would be bad for his health. Hermione looked horrified, and she looked as though she was going to get up and walk across the room to talk to him, but Harry grimly shook his head. The last thing she needed was to associate herself with him in front of the entire school. The only consolation was that his accidental magic tended to work very well on hair. Harry fully expected to have hair again by the next morning. In the meantime, the breeze against his scalp felt different and interesting. If the hair didn't return, he wondered if he might start wearing a turban like Quirrell as a way to mock the man. The worst thing about it was the continual laughter from the Gryffindor table, with pointed glances at him. The Slytherins didn't say anything. There were occasional glances and smirks, but nothing overt. Some of the Slytherins looked a little uncomfortable with the situation, while others seemed to take a grim delight in smirking where he could see it. Harry tried to take note of which students fell into each category. The Slytherins who looked uncomfortable weren't just first years. If he was going to get help from anyone, even if it had to be in secret, it would be from them. He couldn't depend on any Gryffindor other than Hermione and Neville, and they were only first years. He could see how the Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs viewed the Slytherins as well. They weren't as boisterous in their rejection as the Gryffindors, but they were suspicious. Harry began to work out a plan. He wouldn't be able to do it on his own. Learning only what was going to be taught in class was going to be too slow. He'd be no better than anyone else, and he was going to have to be better. If he was going to stop the bullying, he had to be strong enough to make people stop. Given his luck, Quirrell was going to repeatedly kill him, which meant that he couldn't even console himself with the thought that he only had to endure it for 7 years. He might be stuck here for eternity, repeating the same days over and over. Just because he would know when some attacks came didn't mean that other attacks wouldn't occur when the first attacks failed. Learning to fight back was going to be his first challenge, one he intended to begin learning as quickly as he could. Transfigurations that afternoon was a revelation. Watching McGonagall transform a desk into a pig and back again, Harry wondered if he'd be able to do something like that to defend himself. Could you create trained attack pigs, or did they have to be just as stupid as untrained pigs? Harry had once heard that wild boars were willing to eat people, and that spears had to have cross pieces to prevent boars from forcing the spear through their body in attempt to get at the person who'd speared it. He fantasized for a moment about an army of boars attacking Quirrell. Unfortunately, it appeared that his army would have to wait for a long time. He wouldn't even be able to create attack gerbils, much less boars. Instead, they spent much of the session on a set of complicated notes. After that, they tried to turn a match into a needle. Only Blaise Zabini was able to make the slightest change in his needle despite a half hour of trying. Harry didn't even come close, and he felt frustrated by this. He was supposed to be some kind of chosen one, and that ought to have come with some benefits, like being a prodigy at magic. Instead, he was muddling along with the rest of the class, even as his enemies continued to plot against him. His dreams of becoming some kind of wizarding wunderkind didn't seem to be panning out. Still, of his classes so far, charms and transfiguration seemed the most useful. Herbology might be useful once they learned about the more dangerous plants. Harry suspected that potions might be quite useful, but that wasn't until Friday, and flying class came first. Fortunately, his hair had returned by Thursday morning, just as he had predicted. Malfoy looked almost disappointed. That didn't stop the redhead, whose name was apparently Weasley, from making some comments, along with 2 or 3 of the others, whose names he didn't know. Hermione and Neville tried to give him encouraging smiles, but it wasn't enough to make up for their housemates' jibes. The brooms looked old and ill-used, and Harry wondered if someone had tampered with his broom. If they had, there wasn't much he'd be able to do about it. He made sure to be the first one to pick a broom, and he did so randomly. At least, Harry's broom leaped into his hand on the first try. When Harry saw that several of the Gryffindors had been less successful, he smirked at them, leading to angry expressions on their face. He knew it wasn't wise to antagonize them, but at this point none of them knew any more magic than he did. It was the second years and up that he really had to worry about. The smirk left his face as he saw Neville rising on his broom out of control. As Neville fell, he wondered if that was the broom that had been intended for him. If it had been, it wouldn't have been very effective, as Neville was only left with a broken wrist. Malfoy laughed the moment the professor dragged a crying Neville away, and some of the other Slytherins took part in mocking him. Harry wasn't sure what to do about it. If he defended Neville, he might be making it more difficult for Neville with his own housemates. Joining in on the ridicule wouldn't seem right. Keeping quiet was apparently the wrong thing to do as well, because Hermione was looking at him with a disappointed look. It wasn't until Draco grabbed Neville's Remembrall that Harry decided he had to act. Neville had shown them the Remembrall, which he'd said was a gift from his grandmother. Harry couldn't see how useful it was, considering that it didn't even tell you what you didn't remember, but he knew it was important. "I could use one of those," he said to Draco. Draco sneered. "I'm sure you need to be reminded that you don't have any friends." Harry leaned close and said in a low voice, "I think I'll tell everyone just how helpful my good friend Draco has been to me. Best buds that we are and all. I'll bet the upper years will be happy to hear about that when they write home to their parents." He smirked as Draco's face drained of colour. Being a pariah had its uses. Sullenly, Malfoy handed the Remembrall to Harry, who noted that it turned red the moment it touched his hand. Apparently he'd forgotten something, but he couldn't remember what. "Apparently you do need a clue, almost as much as Longbottom," Draco said. He smirked, although it looked forced. "Hope you remember whatever you've forgotten." Weasley acted outraged, going as far as to complain to the professor when she returned. Harry mildly suggested that he had merely been holding it for Neville. From the expressions on the faces of everyone in the crowd, everyone but Hermione thought he was lying. That was exactly the impression he was hoping to give. Flying turned out to be surprisingly enjoyable once he got over his suspicion that his broom was held together by spit and chewing gum. The day was a success. Harry only hoped that potions was as successful. Maybe he could learn to make potions that would give Voldemort boils or something. The only thing that surprised him was that there hadn't been an attempt on his life in days. Harry worried that Voldemort was just waiting for him to let his guard down. Finally, Friday came, and it was time for potions. Although Snape was their head of house, Harry hadn't seen him at all in the week since he'd begun school, except at mealtimes where he sat with the other teachers. He'd have thought that the man would be more involved with his students, but maybe he preferred a hands-off approach. He'd begun to get used to the chill of the dungeons, so the potions classroom didn't seem to bother him at all. Hermione and Neville sat next to him, but unfortunately a number of Gryffindors did so as well. Snape swept into the room with flowing robes, and Harry wondered if the man had theatrical training. His speech about potions had the sense of being something that was well rehearsed, but Harry still couldn't help but be impressed. Stoppering death sounded like exactly the kind of thing he needed. "Potter," Snape asked, "what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "A way to fake your own death," Harry said, "or someone else's." He'd considered using a potion to fake his own death in the hopes that Voldemort and his cronies would give up looking for him, but Voldemort struck him as the kind who would destroy the body just to be safe. After all, a man who named himself Flee from Death had to be paranoid. Snape stared at him for a moment before asking, "What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "They are the same thing," Harry said. "People think that wolfsbane is just poisonous to werewolves, but it's a pretty effective poison on its own. If you take very much of it, you'll go numb and your chest will hurt, you'll throw up and you'll have diarrhea." For some reason, the Gryffindors around him looked uncomfortable. "Planning to poison someone, Potter?" Snape asked, looking him directly in the eye. Harry couldn't help but have a contemplative look on his face. He'd studied the poisons because he was expecting to be poisoned, but he wondered how hard it would be to get to Quirrell's food. It magically appeared from somewhere, but he'd read that food couldn't be created. The question would be how to poison Quirrell without hurting anyone else. Harry wondered why it hadn't occurred to him before. He'd never be safe as long as Quirrell was alive, but killing someone was a huge step. He wasn't sure he'd really want to kill someone, no matter how bad they were. Maybe he could learn how to transfigure him into a doorstop. That way he wouldn't actually have to kill him, but it would get him out of the way. Snape was looking disconcerted for some reason. "Where would you look if I told you to find a bezoar?" "In my pocket," Harry said without thinking. He grimaced. He hadn't actually wanted anyone to know that he had one. He pulled it out. "I think it's stupid not to have one. After all, you never know what people are going to put in your food." He glanced significantly at the Gryffindors. The Weasley boy had the grace to flush, even though the others didn't seem nearly as embarrassed. "And if you lost yours?" "At the apothecary, or the stomach of a goat if I couldn't just buy one." What Potter didn't say was that asphodel and wormwood combine to form the Draught of Living Death. It is a powerful sleeping potion which is used for more than just a tempting fraud. Monkshood and Wolfsbane are also called aconite, and they are just as poisonous as Potter suggested. A bezoar will save you from most, but not all, poisons. Snape was silent for a moment before he snapped, "Why isn't anyone writing this down?" Harry was paired with Hermione for the practical portion of the potions class. Although he felt they were doing reasonably well with their potions, Snape criticized their potion just like he criticized everyone else's except Malfoy. When Neville's cauldron melted, Harry was the first to react. The potion caused boils to erupt all over Neville's arms and legs, and it was melting some of the Gryffindors' shoes. As Snape ranted about adding the porcupine quills before taking the cauldron off the fire, Harry began taking notes. Potions could be dangerous, and apparently misbrewed potions could even become weapons. If he could only find a way to bottle it, Harry would love to pour Neville's potion down Quirrell's back. "Potter," Snape said, "take Longbottom to the hospital wing." Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this chapter. We hope you consider joining our Patreon to help us keep reading stories like this one.